Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you this morning. And of course, my gratitude to my friends and colleagues, Laura and Salvatore, for not only the chance to talk with you, but also for their persistence in including disability issues in the agenda of important events such as this one. So I'm going to talk about the application of positive psychological constructs, including hope, optimism, and self-determination to the disability context, and then implications for life design and career counseling for people with disability. I'm not a counselor. I'm a special educator and a developmental psychologist by training, but I have spent most of my career studying the factors that contribute to the successful transition to a better life for people with disability. And of course, a huge component of a better life is a good job. And you know, we've been talking a lot over the last 2 days about what the circumstances are so difficult at this point in time, and that's true all over the world. But you know, even in the best of times, the unemployment rate of people with disabilities is simply unacceptable, even in countries with a great deal of wealth, such as mine. Our description of the plight of employment for people with disability is last hired, first fired. So in difficult economic times and difficult social times, it becomes even more paramount, I think, that the skilled professionals that are represented in this room pay attention to the needs of people and provide the kind of supports that enable them to achieve better lives. So as I talk, I'm going to be talking from, in general, themes that are echoed in a soon-to-be-published Handbook of Positive Psychology and Disability, which I had the pleasure to edit. It will come out later this summer as part of the Oxford University Press Library of Psychology. And it was a privilege because to this point there's been very little focus on issues of positive psychology and the issues of disability. And so the book, and these 2 slides just give you the table of contents. You know, it covers what we know about disability and psychology in familiar areas such as quality of life, optimism, social well-being, coping, self-determination, hope, resilience, career development and career thought, self-regulation, as well as examining issues in positive psychology and disability across the lifespan and within specific disability populations. You know, we know quite a lot, as some of you will know, about gaining employment for people with disability. There is a considerable amount of knowledge and work in the world that shows that people, even people with quite extensive support needs, can gain and hold and benefit from employment. But we continue to find ourselves in circumstances, good or bad, that the unemployment rate or the employment rate is unacceptable. So we have to ask ourselves why. And I think many of us believe that it is as much about the expectations that are held for people and about people with disability and how disability is understood. And one of the themes that virtually every author in this textbook began their chapter with was the seeming incongruity between the notion of disability and these ideas of positive psychology. Because, to put it bluntly, across history, people with disabilities have not been viewed in the context of strengths and capacities. In fact, for most of history, disability has been seen primarily as a problem or a fault within a person. Disability was understood within a model that was an extension of a medical model that conceived health as an interiorized state and health problems as individual pathologies. And when disability is understood in that context, it becomes understood to be a health problem within the person that was a characteristic of that person, as somehow residing within the person. And the person, him or herself, became viewed as in some way broken or diseased or pathological or atypical or aberrant. All those words are just words for outside the norm, as different. And perhaps unavoidably, within such conceptualizations, people with disabilities were associated with often very negative stereotypes and were held universally to very low expectations, with no expectation often of work or relationships or the things we've talked about here in terms of life design. And my colleagues in this room who focus on disability issues will know, though, that we've begun to change how we understand disability. We had discussions about this at an excellent set of sessions yesterday evening. Because as we neared the end of the 20th century, it became increasingly evident around the world that these traditional notions of disability were simply no longer useful. They were no longer helpful. People with disabilities became more and more a part of society. They held jobs, they succeeded in education, they became contributing members of society. And as this became more and more true and more evident, these conceptualizations of people with disability as somehow broken or diseased just didn't make sense. It no longer made sense. These people were being able to function and to be successful in the same ways that the rest of us are. And so in what way is that person broken? If you're able, even though requiring supports of holding a meaningful job or succeeding at college or being a member of a community, what ways is a person broken? In 1980, then, the World Health Organization introduced the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps, which proposed essentially that chronic and pervasive health issues, including disability, are best understood in the context of more person-environment fit kinds of models. And that environment and context were in some ways more important than disease. And in 2001, the World Health Organization took a step even further and introduced the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, which is no longer a classification system of disease. It's a classification system of human functioning and the ways in which people along a continuum exist within this context of functioning. The ICF, as some of you know, I'm sure, is a biopsychosocial model in which disability and functioning are viewed as outcomes of interactions between health conditions and contextual factors. And these contextual factors include, obviously, environment and personal factors. The important point to make about the ICF is that disability became understood only in the context of typical human functioning. Disability within ICF serve as an umbrella term referring to limitations in activity and in restrictions in participation. So it views disability simply in this context of activity limitations and participation restrictions that result from factors that might be health related, but also have a clear contextual relationship. And again, the key point is that disability, how we understand disability, changes. So let me present this in another way. Within traditional understandings of disability, and those are still too prevalent throughout the world, and I believe that in most cases, most people still understand disability as, in some way, shape, or form, that the person is broken and or pathological. And we prove that by using things like the DSM, which somebody mentioned earlier, and other tools to begin to measure and to report on the incompetence of people with disabilities. So that through proving incompetence, people become eligible, if you will, for systems that provide supports. But these new models, which Europe has a head start on in understanding and conceptualizing. The United States is behind Europe in our widespread adoption of this, so we have to work very hard to bring my countrymen up to speed on some of this. These new models replace so that disability does not reside in the person. It's not seen as a fault within a person, but as an outcome of the interaction between the person's capacities, competence, capabilities, and the demands of the context. So disability no longer is understood as something that the person has, but as the gap between the person's strengths and the demands of the context. This shift in conceptualizing disability this way has very important ramifications, and quite honestly, I don't believe a volume on positive and psychology and disability was possible before we began rethinking how we understood disability. Because first and foremost, this is a strengths-based model. We're not interested in what people can't do. We want to understand what people do well and what they're interested in and what they value, and begin to build on that. And it looks as much at the context, not fixing the person, but changing the context. And there are a myriad of ways that we can modify and change context, whether it's a work or other community-based context. Technology is enabling us to do things more and more that any of us couldn't do. I'm able to do more with my smartphone than without my smartphone. I'm more successful. And of course, this model views disability in the context of typical human functioning, not as apart from, not as separate from. So, and then it leads us to consider supports. What kind of supports do people, historically around the world, we have looked at disability as this compendium of deficits, and we have designed programs that match those deficits. And what these new models are insisting that we do is that we begin to design supports that enable people to be successful, that it's no longer acceptable that somebody cannot be fully and gainfully employed. The problem is not the person, the problem is on us to figure out how we modify the context and enable capacity so that people are able to be successful. Supports are resources and strategies that promote the interest and causes of people with and without disabilities, that enable them to access resources, information, relationships, all those things that we need to engage in these types of reciprocity and the things you've been hearing about within integrated work and living and learning environments, and that result in the enhanced interdependence, productivity, community integration, and satisfaction of people. Supports are personalized, and they move us away from these programs where we send people to the design of personalized supports in contexts that are valued. You know, Shane, my colleague Shane yesterday said that the survey, the Gallup poll shows that everyone wants a good job and a loving family. Gallup doesn't survey people with disability, but I'm going to tell you, people with disability want a good job and they want a happy family. And among people in the world, probably the least likely people in our societies to have those two things are people with disabilities. And it's not because they can't, it's because we haven't. We haven't figured out how to provide those supports. So, we're trying different ways to begin looking at things. Measurement is important. We value what we measure, right? And we measure what we value. And it's a reciprocal relationship. Colleagues and I at the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities have been working on ways to measure support. Because in most places we use proxies like intelligence, IQ scores to make decisions about who gets what kinds of supports. Well, that's not very exact. In fact, it's very inexact. People who have the same IQ often have very different support needs. So we've developed a tool, the Supports Intensity Scale. It's been translated and has been widely adopted in Italy and in 19 other countries. And it's beginning to move us away from our urge to document defect and deficiency to begin to measure, to identify where in their lives people need support and what types of supports they need in order to be successful. So let me talk then a little bit. So changing the way we understanding disability opens the door for us to begin to talk about things like hope and optimism. In the past, people with disabilities were often talked about as having false hope. And I remember a disability advocate once talking about her and her friends having got together and planned a life for her outside of the institution. And she said, I was so glad that my friends and I could get together and share some false hope. There is no such thing. Hope is hope. And for people with disabilities, hope is often the only thing that they can grasp onto. And we need to enable them not only to have both aspects of that hope, both the agency to be able to create the kinds of life that matters for them. So we've looked at these issues in positive psychology and disability, and I want to give you some illustration that simply point out that we have a ways to go and that we need to pay attention to this. It's time. We now have reasons to do so. In a study that several colleagues, including Shane Lopez and I, conducted a number of years ago, we looked at the content of traditional intellectual and developmental disability journals to examine the articles published across 3 decades to see how much they focused on individual strengths versus defects or deficits. And you can see that across these decades, the percentage and the number of articles increased in terms of a focus on some relevant positive psychological construct or work in issues around self-determination, which we've pulled out for reasons I'll talk about in a moment. But that if you look at that as of the end of, what was that, 2004 or something like that, there was still fewer than a third of articles published had any mention of any strengths-based focus. So our field, our disability focus, has a long way to go. We've got to change and to have a more robust knowledge about what people do well and strengths and those kinds of things. But that's true in positive psychology as well. In the textbook, my colleague at KU went through the literature in positive psychology to determine what disability focus was in the positive psychology literature. And she found that only 4% of articles published between 2006 and 2011 mentioned disability at all. And we'll talk about what kinds of disability they tend to mention, but I'll tell you it tends to be chronic illness and disease. And then our colleagues in Larios, in their chapter, looked at vocational guidance journals over a 10-year period, and there were only 11 articles that focused on issues of vocational guidance and issues of disability, and that only 5 of those focused on any positive psychological theme. So it's clear that we all have to do better. We have to do better in disability at focusing not on deficits. Positive psychology, life design, vocational guidance has to do better. We've all got work to do. So what do we know? Well, I've just chosen a few representative things that have been talked about here to give you just a sense of really how little we know, because that's the answer. We don't know very much. If you look at specific psychological construct, what becomes clear is that we know most about these constructs in the context of severe injury or chronic disease, as I mentioned. We know that optimism predicts, for example, more positive psychological responses to diseases such as women undergoing surgery for breast cancer or men undergoing coronary artery bypass. Both groups in which more hopeful and optimistic people have better quality of life and reduce distress after diagnosis. We know that optimism is related to coping styles that are more adaptive under conditions of severe health problems. But with our textbook, we made the decision not to venture into, as much as we could, the realm of what I would call rehabilitation psychology or chronic and acquired disability. We were interested in people who have a lifespan history with disability, people who have lifelong disability, because we believe that the identities that are constructed by people who live with disability all their life differ from people who acquire disability later on in their life. And it's because of the circumstances, I think, of their lives and how others respond to them and how they begin to think about themselves. And if you look at that population, people with lifelong disability, there's really very little research, almost none. We know, there's no reason to believe that optimism won't act in exactly the same way among people with lifelong disability. We did a study, and I've given you a snapshot of that looked at, for people with intellectual disability, the degree to which perceptions of control and hope and optimism and self-determination contributed to life satisfaction, and what we suspected pretty much happened, that this was indeed the case. Particularly hope and optimism were particularly direct predictors of well-being and life satisfaction, and self-determination and perceptions of control mediated the effect. So there's no reason to believe that these don't work in very similar ways, but we really know very little about that. And I would also note that our second conference theme, resilience here, there's very little work in anything beyond chronic disease because in traditional models of resilience, an average IQ is often a criteria for being involved in the research. And so anyone who just has an IQ below the mean is excluded from the research. I will tell you, I know a lot of people with intellectual disability who are among the most resilient people in the world. They have lived through institutionalization, they have lived through discrimination, and yet they're not talked about in these terms of resilience. And it's another example of what we need to do to change. There is, in fact, though, a large body of research in the area of self-determination, because a few decades ago it became a focus in transition. It was felt that if young people were to transition to successful outcomes as young adults, that we needed to focus on enhanced self-determination. In our work, and we've been engaged with this work along with our colleagues here at Padua and really all around the world, we view self-determination as a general psychological construct that is within the broader organizing area of human agentic behavior. And we talk about issues of self-determination as people who see themselves as the origin of their actions. People who are self-determined are authors of their own lives, which of course we've been talking about constructing lives, and I can think of few things that are perhaps more important to constructing lives. In our own work, we talked about self-determination and self-determined behavior as volitional action, acting based upon preference and choice, but acting intentionally, intentional choice, to become causal agents in one's own life. And it's an important distinction for us because a great many people believe that people with disabilities cannot be self-determined because they equate self-determination with independence and doing things yourself and complete autonomy. Now, whether any of us have those characteristics is a debatable point. But if there are many things you can't do for yourself, then people tend to dismiss. But in fact, of course, as our speaker the last time said, that knowing the roots of the word is helpful. Self-determination is a form of self-determinism, self-caused action. People cause things to happen in their own lives. And I know everyone, in some way, shape, or form, causes things to happen in their lives, often in ways that seem difficult to understand if you don't speak like the rest of the people around you do, or you don't have the ability to communicate more complex thoughts. We know a lot about self-determination and the impact of promoting and enhancing the self-determination on children, youth, and adults with disabilities. First of all, we know, unfortunately, that people with disabilities universally are less self-determined than their non-disabled peers. But we also know that in large measure that is because they've never had the opportunity to learn the skills that lead to one becoming more self-determined. Nobody's talked about goal setting or problem solving or decision making. They've simply done things to people as opposed to engage them in that. So we know the environments in which people live, learn, work, and play restrict their opportunities to make choices, to express preferences. So we mustn't presume that somebody can't. And in fact, the literature is very clear that people can learn the skills that enable them to become more self-determined. We know that greater self-determination predicts better quality of life status. We know that young people who leave high school as more self-determined young people are more independent after graduation. They're more likely to hold a job 1 year and 3 years out. They're significantly more likely in the U.S., unfortunately, to have, where you get health care from a job. So if you're excluded from the workforce, you're excluded from health care. There is a huge health care crisis among people with disability who have no access to the American health care system. Hopefully that's changing. We've recently completed research that provides causal links to outcomes including better employment and greater community inclusion by promoting and enhancing the self-determination of children and youth with disabilities. And as I've mentioned, we know that if we afford youth and adults the opportunity to learn goal-setting skills, to solve problems, that they are able to do so. And in fact, they often achieve greater than what our expectations are, because our expectations are based upon what we've known before. So, that's an example of an area where there has been work and it has been shown to be effective and to be important. We have, some of the other things, I've talked a little bit about problem solving and decision making. We know that when provided opportunities to learn to solve problems, people can do this. Some colleagues of mine at Columbia University have been engaged in working with people with intellectual disability to learn a decision-making and problem-solving process that would keep them from harm or at the risk for sexual and domestic abuse. They work in New York City, and they discovered that a large percentage of women, particularly with intellectual and developmental disabilities, were experiencing sexual and domestic abuse. And so they began doing the unheard of, teaching them to recognize situations that are risk situations. And I would point out the issue of gender and gender inequity in the workforce was brought up last time. We've done work in gender inequity in special education and disability. If you look at women who are under and unemployed, women with disabilities are at the bottom of that list. They are less likely to be employed than men with disabilities. So again, it's a double jeopardy, disability and gender in that case, that results in substantially less positive outcomes. And they've become more this is work that's evolving in the way that these kinds of disciplines should evolve, because it was based upon this very real crisis, and they had very good success. And their chapter is an excellent example of how, if we put our mind to it, we can change things. So implications. Let me wrap up with implications. I think one is, I implore you to presume competence. It is no longer useful at all to think about incompetence. Find out what people do well, find out what people like, and find a way to modify the context and the environment so that people can be successful. The impetus is on us. We know that if we promote self-determination, and I think if we promote hope and optimism, that we're going to see positive outcomes. We have data showing that people with disabilities achieve more positive employment and life-related outcomes if they're given the opportunity. That's international data, Italy and Canada, and we've worked all around the world. This is true all around the world. And it's irrelevant to the level of support you need. We can do this with people who need much more extensive support, or people whose support are limited. We know that involving young people in planning about their lives results in more positive self-determination and better outcomes. So if you're engaged in planning around life design, engage the person, involve the person, and enable them to participate and to set goals that matter to them, and to be engaged in decisions that impact their lives. Emphasize goal setting, problem solving, self-regulation. We've had a great deal of success with a model that we've called the self-determined learning model of instruction that teaches teachers to teach students to teach themselves. And it's basically self-regulated problem solving, leading to setting a goal, creating an action plan, and then adjusting the goal or the action plan as necessary. This is how all of us succeed. It's what we need to teach young people and adults with disabilities to do. And finally, we need to focus more on strengths and to examine the impact of these positive psychological constructs like hope and optimism and resilience and coping and so forth on the lives of people. A deficits focus has gotten us as far as we can go. It's time that we consider what people with disabilities can do and how we can provide supports that enable them to be successful. It is time, essentially, to go beyond pathology. So, thank you very much.